All right, and now let's continue our discussion of the theory of forms. Now we're jumping into the Phaedo, and we're looking at the proofs for an immortal soul. So remember why we need this, right? Plato is claiming that there's a soul that can or does live in the same immaterial realm as the forms before it's embodied. So when it is embodied, it carries all of that knowledge with it, and we can recollect it. And so Plato is claiming that the soul will continue to last after our death, and so we'll continue to carry that knowledge, so on and so forth, possibly through multiple reincarnations, whatever ends up happening. But no matter what it is, the soul is this immortal thing that can exist apart from the body. Now, for most of us in this culture and society, this doesn't seem so drastic, right? So the common way we think about the soul is that it is something that exists apart from the body, right? If you believe in a soul. But even if you don't believe in a soul, you realize many Christians and theists believe that after they die, their soul continues on into some other realm. In Plato and Socrates' time, this is not a common thought, right? The thought in ancient Greece is that the soul does bring life to the body, but when you die, both the soul and the body in some way perish. Right, so Plato is making a drastic claim for his time, right, that the soul can exist apart from the body, and that is an immortal soul. So we need to see if he can justify this, right? All he's given us so far is that, well, in the Meno, we saw the slave could recollect some geometrical knowledge, and the best explanation for that is that there's a soul that exists before embodiment, but we don't have any proof that the soul exists after embodiment. All right, so let's see if he can get us that. So the two major themes then in the Phaedo are that the soul is immortal. They spend a lot of time arguing for this. And then also that the lover of wisdom should not fear death. The philosopher should not fear death. And as we look through these two types of arguments, especially the argument that we shouldn't fear death, we're going to get a lot more insight into the forms and how we can acquire knowledge. So let's look into that. So first, let's look at the second claim, that the lover of wisdom should not fear death. Socrates has already said this before, right? So in the Apology, Socrates said that he doesn't fear death and that he shouldn't fear death, that he doesn't fear the threat of execution from the assembly. But here his reasoning is a little bit different. In the Apology, he said, we shouldn't be afraid of death because we don't know what death entails, right? Death could be the greatest thing for you. It could be terrible. And Socrates said it makes no sense to fear something that you're uncertain is good or bad. Right, so uncertainty is why we shouldn't fear death. Now, in the Phaedo, he's saying we shouldn't fear death at all because it's one of the greatest goods a man can receive, or anybody can receive. Right? And he says, a man who has truly spent his life in the love of wisdom feels confident when about to die, and is hopeful that, when he has died, he will win very great benefits in the other world. So what's the explanation for the shift here? Why are we going from agnostic about death, uncertain about death, to completely certain that it's one of the best things that can happen to us? And here Socrates says some stuff that you might expect about knowledge, right? Given what we said before, remember, embodiment is this really sort of, not terrible, but embodiment is, as far as you're searching for wisdom, embodiment is a terrible thing, right? Because it's flooding your soul with all these false beliefs about the visible world, about your body, about your culture. And so it makes it harder to obtain knowledge. And that's roughly what Socrates is going to say against the body. And here he says, and now what about the actual gaining of wisdom? Is the body a hindrance or not, if one enlists it as a partner in the quest? This is the sort of thing I mean. Do sight and hearing afford men any truth, or are not even the poets always harping on such themes, telling us that we neither hear nor see anything accurately? And yet if all of the bodily senses are neither accurate nor clear, then the others will hardly be so, because they are surely all inferior to those senses of sight and hearing. And so the soul reasons best, presumably, whenever none of these things bothers it, neither hearing, nor sight, nor pain, nor any pleasure either, but whenever it comes to be alone by itself as far as possible, disregarding the body, and whenever the least possible communion and contract with it, it strives for that which is. Okay, so that's a mouthful there, but what's he saying, right? So roughly, death is great because those of us who are interested in wisdom or the truth are constantly hindered by the body, right? These false beliefs that it's flooding us with make it hard for us to understand the truth. And if we could just separate ourselves from the body, we would gain all of this wisdom. So in life, the philosopher is trying, or the lover of wisdom is trying as best they can to separate themselves from the body in their thinking and their rationality, right? They try and ignore the beliefs that the body is giving them and exist sort of only in the intelligible world. But unfortunately, when we're alive, we can only do that to a limited extent, right? The body is still there. It's not like we can completely ignore it, and the body is going to keep giving us these false beliefs. So we can restrict the body, we can temper it, we can be sort of like ascetic or monk-like and try and bring ourselves as close to pure rationality as possible. But only in death can we really escape the body and get as close to truth or wisdom as possible. And so that's why Socrates is now claiming that death is one of the greatest goods that man can receive, because it eliminates the hindrance of the body and gets us closer to wisdom or truth. So, summary, it's a hindrance that makes the search for truth drastically more difficult. And so we should welcome death. Now, quickly afterwards, Cebes makes the following objection to what Socrates is saying, right? He says, look, the other things you said, Socrates, seem excellent to me. But what you said about the soul leaves a man to worry that when the soul is released from the body, it may no longer exist anywhere, but may be dispersed like breath or smoke and vanish away, so that nothing is left of it anywhere. If it somehow existed itself, according to itself, released from all the problems that you described, that would provide much hope that what you said is true. But this requires on your part no little soothing speaking, and it requires on our part no little trust to believe the soul exists after death and retains some power and intelligence. So what's he saying here? You should always take some time to try and parse these things out for yourself. But roughly, we have Socrates saying, look, death is fantastic. It separates us from the body. It separates us from that thing that hinders our search for truth. Right? We're finally free of these false beliefs. We can get back to our pure knowledge where we know the relations of all things. And Cebes says, well, wait a second. All you've proven so far is that the soul existed before the body, right? The soul, we have this ability to recollect, we have this knowledge because our soul had it prior to embodiment, but you haven't shown us that the soul is going to continue to exist outside the body after death, right? In other words, you haven't proven that the soul is immortal, you've only proven that the soul existed before the body. Why should we believe that the soul is going to continue to exist after we die? Maybe when the body dies, the soul dies too, and that's the end of it. Or maybe when the body dies, the soul continues, but in such a hindered state, in such a changed, diminished state, that it doesn't have those intellectual powers anymore. So although the body might be a hindrance to knowledge right now, if the soul can only really exist with the body in that sort of perfect form, then we should be fighting tooth and nail to avoid death even as lovers of wisdom. Right? So the body might be holding you back, but if it's all you got, then you got to cling on to it. And so we should still fear death, is what he's saying here. Okay, so Socrates says, don't fear death. It separates you from the body, gets you closer to truth. Sieb says, no, you haven't proven that the soul is going to continue existing after death. And so what Socrates needs to do now is prove that the soul is immortal. And this week in your textbook for the course, you read a lot about this. So once again, I'm not going to harp on this, but I am going to give a quick summary of each one. And if you have more questions, feel free to email me. But so roughly, Plato gives 4 arguments here. Socrates is giving Plato's arguments. Right? First is the argument from opposites. Right? If all things come from their opposites, then death comes from life and life comes from death. So our soul must exist in the realm of death before birth, before embodiment, so that our life, our material bodily life, can come from death. Right? If the soul wasn't already in some sense conjoined with death there, or in the realm of the dead, then life couldn't come from death. But we know things come from their opposites. Socrates cites a list of examples in the text to show that things come from their opposites. Right, but an important note about this argument is that it doesn't prove the soul continues to exist in the realm of the dead after our first bodily death, unless there's an endless cycle of reincarnation, right? So maybe death comes from life and life comes from death, and our soul sits in the realm of the dead, then it comes to life, and then after life we go to death, but death could just be nothingness that second time around. Maybe the body and soul are both destroyed at the same time. So this first argument doesn't actually prove that the soul is immortal. Once again, it does prove that we do have some soul, though, if it's true. The argument from recollection says, look, we have these recollections. We have knowledge of these perfect things, right? Just like the slave recollected his knowledge about perfect geometrical objects, we have these same type of recollections. But you can't recollect a perfect object by your experience in the real world, because your experience in the real world is entirely of imperfect objects. So, in other words, you can't recollect a perfect object by experiencing imperfect objects. Right? You can't get to those perfect qualities if all you've ever seen are imperfect qualities, is what he's saying here. So, since we only experience imperfect objects in this life, we must have a soul which existed prior to the body, which had direct experience of the perfect objects. Right, so recollecting perfect objects shows that we must have seen these objects prior to our embodiment. Once again, though, this doesn't prove that the soul is immortal. It just shows that your soul existed and existed before your embodiment. Maybe afterward, it just peters into non-existence. All right, and then the final two are that the soul is similar to the forms. So the soul is more like the forms and it's like the body. And so since the forms are deathless, insoluble, and intelligible, the soul has to be that way too. In other words, the soul is so dislike the body and so similar to the forms that the qualities it has must be similar to the forms as well. And so since the forms are these eternal things, the soul must be an eternal thing. And then next is that the soul participates essentially in the form of life. So the soul participates essentially in the form of life since it alone brings life to the body, and it lives, clearly as we've seen now, before the body. And so if it's going to participate essentially in life, essentially being the key word here, then it can't participate in the qualities of death. Otherwise, it's not participating essentially in life. So that would mean, by participating essentially in life, that the soul is deathless. And now 3 and 4 rely largely on us accepting the theory of forms, right? So arguments 1 and 2 show that there's a soul and it pre-exists the body, doesn't show that it's immortal. 3 and 4 would show that it's immortal, but it also requires you to accept the theory of forms. So apart from the recollection shown in the Meno, we haven't gotten any other argument that the forms exist. And so the recollection is the main argument we've seen so far, that there's knowledge of perfect things predating the body. The theory of recollection in the Meno is the only really proof we have so far for the theory of forms. So why else should we believe in the theory of forms? We will wrap that up in the next video. Thanks, everyone.